A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase.
I built this desk. I didn't build it. I turned an old kitchen table into this desk, and I'm very proud of it, but it's not without its problems. Anyway, today we shall be turning this image into this image, which is probably not to everybody's taste, but I think my most requested video type is taking a photo from start to finish in an edit. So I thought today was a good day to do it while I hide from hay fever. So great being an outdoors photographer and being allergic to the outdoors. Anyway, I nearly didn't get this photo because I got up at 4 AM a few weeks ago in Italy and went to this spot not really knowing just how popular it was. I mean, I knew it was a popular photo spot. I've seen lots of photos from here before, but yeah, there were 50 other photographers lined up by the time I arrived. So yeah, I nearly didn't bother getting out of the car because I knew I wasn't going to get anything remotely unique. That said, I don't know if anyone else got this flying bird or insect or whatever that is in their shot. What's the shutter speed? 25th of a second. So yeah, it might be a bird. Could be an insect that's much closer to the camera. We'll never know, I suspect, but I shall heal that like so. As you might also be able to see, we have some dust spots in the background over here. Kind of to be expected. I mean, I did shoot this at 200mm, but it's also at f14, so dust spots are a fact of life at that kind of aperture for me. But I'm not going to worry too much about those because I want to get rid of all that detail anyway. So basically the first thing I do when I come across a photo that I'm going to edit is I try to assess what I want to do with the photo as a whole, where I want to take it, what I want the edit to achieve before I start pushing sliders around. And in this image, it was a nice morning, definitely. I mean, I was a bit frustrated when I first arrived that as well as 50 other photographers being there, the conditions weren't anywhere near as good as I had seen previously. This valley is quite well known for kind of low-hanging mist, and there wasn't really all that much mist. There was more of a haze, like a blanket haze, which means that the background is just as visible as the foreground. That's not true. Obviously the foreground is a bit more visible, but there's not as much separation and contrast between the foreground and the subject and the background. Everything's just a bit hazy, and what I think that means is that the background is a little bit distracting, more so than I would want it to be. So first thing I'm going to do is try and make the background a little bit less distracting, therefore pulling your eye towards the foreground and the subject, which is this farmhouse here, obviously. Right, so I'm going to do that with a mask. I'm going to select a linear gradient, and I'm just going to pull that down to something like that. And then I'm going to drag down the dehaze. In other words, I'm going to add haze. Now that works to an extent. The background is definitely less distracting now, but it also gets rid of detail in things that I would like to keep, namely, just get rid of this farmhouse on this hill here and the hill behind it, which has got a really nice row of trees. I like those two things, and I also like this clump of trees over here. So I would like some of that detail back without bringing back the distracting foreground. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my masks, and then I'm going to click on the three dots on this mask, go intersect mask with luminance range, and then I'm just going to select one of the really bright areas, like so. And what we now see in red is a selection within a selection, basically. This is now what's selected within the linear gradient, if that makes sense. And so we can nudge this slider around, and what hopefully you can see is that as I do that, more and less detail comes out in the darker parts of the selection. And what I'm aiming to do is try and bring back just enough detail in the darker parts of the selection, which are these trees and the farmhouse, basically. Something like that. I think looks pretty good. So let's have a look at the before and the after. So we've still got the detail where we want the detail, but we've got rid of the distractions where there were distractions, I think. That's a good first step. I should also say, before we go any further, that everything that I do in this edit will be way over the top, because I watch a lot of tutorials, things like portraiture on YouTube, and I just can't follow them because the changes are so subtle that I can't really see what the photographer has done. And I enjoy watching things like portraiture editing tutorials on YouTube because I've not got a clue how to edit portraits, so it's fun. But yeah, I like to be able to see what's going on Therefore, I shall go way over the top with this edit. Right, next thing I'm going to do is introduce a bit more light. As you can see, there was a sunrise that morning, but it wasn't kind of punching through the scene. It was kind of hidden behind a cloud a lot of the time, hence the kind of hazy, diffused light. And while I don't mind that, I'd like to make the light a little bit more impactful. So again, I'm going to grab another mask, and this is the oldest trick in the book. I'm going to go to radial gradient, and then I'm just going to pull that radial gradient over here somewhere, coming from the direction of the light, and then I'm going to boost the temperature and also up the exposure. Now the problem with upping the exposure, as you can see, is that we're at risk of losing the detail that we've just tried to pull back with a luminance range mask. If I keep raising that, we're just going to lose the detail in those trees in the background. So instead of raising exposure, what I might do is just raise the highlights instead, which should impact the detail on the hills less. So something like that. Might go for a bit more magenta as well. Yeah, something like that I think looks pretty good. Again, let's have a look at the before and after. Before, after, get rid of that actually. Before, after. Nice. Okay, before we start nudging the general sliders around, one more mask for the time being, I think, and that is to bring out a bit more punch and detail in the foreground and the subject. So again, I'm going to go to luminance range, and I'm just going to select a dark area down here, something like that. And that's done a pretty good job of selecting basically what I want selected, because this is the only part of the image where you've got really, really dark tones. And essentially what I'm going to try and do is make some of those dark tones a bit darker. So I'm going to bring down the blacks just to introduce a touch more contrast. I might nudge the dehaze slider up a bit, and I think what I'll also do, which I don't often do actually, is just raise the saturation of this area just a touch. And I might, no, I'm not going to do that actually. I was going to bring down the temperature of this area, but I think there are better ways to make the shadows colder than playing around with temperature in this way. So I'll do that in a minute. But that, for the time being, I think looks pretty good. Let's look at all our masks on, and if I switch them off, so that's what we've done so far. We've basically just tried to draw attention towards the subject and away from the distracting elements in the scene. And we've added a boatload more light. Okay, happy with that for the time being. Now we can start attacking these sliders. Exposure I'm pretty happy with, I think. I think the image is pretty well exposed, something like that. Might be a touch better, but I've not really done anything there really. Highlights, I'm interested to see how much highlight detail we still have in those bright parts of the image, and the answer is not lots, but I think bringing down the slider does help to bring back a little bit of detail, but it's not distracting, so I quite like that. So yeah, I'm going to keep that there. Shadows I might nudge up just a touch. You might have noticed if you have my preset pack that I quite like to treat shadows and blacks independently of each other. Quite often I raise the shadows, but I'll bring down the blacks. And that's because often I like shadow detail, but if you have really light shadows and really dark highlights, often your image can look not particularly contrasty. And just controlling the blacks, as I might do here, helps just keep contrast, but at the same time have detail in your shadows. So something like that looks quite nice to my eye. Texture and clarity I usually bring down a touch. I'm not the biggest fan of those two effects, particularly on mornings like this where you've got a really hazy atmosphere. If you have too much clarity, it just looks horrific, so I don't particularly like that. Vibrance I might just check out just like this to see what sort of colour we have available to us. I'm not going to keep the vibrance slider all the way up here, but I like having a look before I start playing around with the colour tools, what colour is available basically. And there's quite a lot. Yellows, greens, as you'd expect I suppose. So I'll bring that back down. Now the first colour tool we come to is the tone curve, and actually the first tone curve you come to, the point curve, is nothing to do with colour at all. And basically, if you're not that familiar with tone curves, lots of people get a bit scared by them. There's really no need, they're very simple. Basically, everything in the bottom half of this curve is shadows, so I can bring down the shadows or I can boost the shadows. Similarly, in the top half of the curve, I can bring down the highlights or I can boost the highlights. And you can stick points on here wherever you like, and you can play around with different tones to your heart's content, basically. Now typically in scenes like this, I don't do a hell of a lot with my tone curves. What I will probably do though is bring up the tone of the blacks, or the very dark parts of the image, something like that. Now, even though I've brought down the blacks on the sliders, in images like this where you've got lots of haze, it can often look a bit strange if your image has true black in it. So I don't particularly like that. So rather than have true black, I'll raise the tone of the black just a touch, and I'll still have very dark blacks, but they won't be true black, which I think just looks a little bit more realistic. Now as far as the channels go, the colour channels, basically it's exactly the same premise. You can control the shadows and the highlights independently, but this time, rather than bringing down shadows and raising highlights or vice versa, you're changing colour. So again, if I stick some points on this curve, you can see on the blue channel that in the top half you've got blue, and in the bottom half you've got the opposite, which is yellow. In the green channel you've got green and magenta, in the red channel you've got red and cyan. Now if we go back to the blue channel, what I can do here is I can move my shadows towards blue, which will make my shadows more blue, and therefore they will appear colder. I can also move my highlights towards yellow, which should help make my highlights appear warmer. And basically that's how tone curves work, and it's a fantastically powerful tool. Let's see what the tone curve has done. So we've just basically introduced a bit of coolness in the shadows and a bit more warmth in the highlights. Let's go to the green channel, and I think I want a bit more magenta in my highlights. Not quite that much. Something like that I think looks pretty good. And maybe a touch more green in my shadows. Yeah, something like that. Red channel, maybe a touch more red in my shadows, and maybe a touch more cyan in my highlights. I mean, I'm really just undoing the work I did on the blue channel here, but yeah, just for the point of demonstration, that's what tone curves do. Next, the HSL sliders, and this, to be honest, is where I do most of the heavy lifting with my colour. Now, a lot of it has been done in this instance by the fact that I introduced a radial filter with all the light. I don't need to do a whole lot with colour, I don't think, but typically what I do with hue, and especially on a morning like this, is I'll bring the yellows towards orange, I'll bring the oranges towards red, and I'll bring the greens towards yellow, and that just boosts the warmth, basically. And yes, as I said before, I've gone way too far with those, so we'll just dial those back a little bit. Saturation, I want to introduce a bit more orange, maybe a little bit more yellow. Oh yes, look at that. We're really getting to grips with this light now. Perhaps a touch more green. And luminance, I might try and bring down the luminance of the orange. Something like that. I mean, that looks quite painterly, but it also looks entirely just not realistic or believable. So we'll dial that back up a touch, but that looks quite nice. And then I might take the yellows up a bit. Something like that. Okay, lovely. That looks pretty good, I think. And then colour grading. I don't typically get too technical with this. Basically, in this instance, what I'll probably do again is make the shadows a bit cooler. Something like that. And I'll make the highlights a bit warmer. Something like that. And you can play around with the balance, as you can see, just down here. But I like something like that. Again, we are going a bit too far with this edit. Sharpening, I don't typically touch. I mean, that's set to 40, but ultimately sharpening is all about your output. So if I'm going to be printing an image, my sharpening will be different to if I'm sticking an image on Instagram, for example. So I don't typically play around with sharpening all that much in the detail module. Lens corrections, this was shot at 200mm, like I said, but you do still need profile corrections because there is still a little bit of distortion. And that, to be honest, is about it. As I said, this is probably not exactly how the final version will look. In fact, this is the final version, but I've used all the same techniques that we've just gone through here. I've maybe just played around with them for a little bit longer. And to save you the boredom of sitting watching me do that, yeah, I won't put you through it. And yeah, in short, that is how I edit my photos-ish. I mean, I usually just use a preset, to be honest, but those presets will try and achieve this kind of thing. But a big thank you for watching, and a big thank you also to the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. So as you know, I have used Squarespace for years as my portfolio. I had a blog at one point. It's my online store. I send newsletters via Squarespace functionality. It's fantastic. And if you're a photographer and you've got work you want to showcase online, I wouldn't look any further than Squarespace. Basically, you don't need to be technical in any way. You can choose from lots of different templates that get you roughly the look you want, and then it's just a case of adding your own images via drag and drop and playing around with sliders to get the fonts and the sizes and the colours that you want. It's brilliantly simple. I absolutely love it. Even the online store stuff. This morning, I added a new product to my store. Basically, you can now buy multiple prints in one go for a saving, and it was super simple. And yeah, on the topic of newsletters, thank you for all of you for hounding me. I do try and make them monthly. I don't always remember. My bad. I shall work on another one this afternoon if I'm still hiding inside from the pollen. And you can get a free trial for Squarespace by going to squarespace.com, and after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off of that first purchase. So a big thank you to them for their continued support of this channel, and thanks to you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Next time, if the pollen's gone, we shall be back outside, because I don't really like being inside doing videos, as I've said before. This is a photography channel. I want to be out doing photography. I just don't want to be sneezing all day. See you soon.